unit price. I want to start off echoing Stephanie's sentiments of acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we're all on today. I am, of course, I'm down in Melbourne, so I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge that these lands have never been ceded. I'd also like to note that I have no conflicts of interest in this talk. So I've never taken money from the alcohol industry and never will. And I think that's an important point to ask of alcohol policy evaluators, particularly in the Northern Territory, where that's not always the case. Um, so here's a little overview of everything we're going to be talking about today. I really want to give a thorough breakdown of what the minimum unit price is, why we think it works or how it's meant to work, then take a look at all the evidence about its impact on consumption, sales, and harms. Maybe a bit of a hopeful, or I don't know if it's naively hopeful, look into the future potential benefits of the minimum unit price, and ending on some of the real challenges in this space, particularly as they pertain to the Northern Territory. But first off, who am I? Why do I think I can talk about this subject? So I was one of the people who were involved in the initial 1 year evaluation of the minimum unit price. I should say I'm an alcohol policy researcher. I've been in this space since about 2015. Um, there's not a whole lot of research on the Northern Territory minimum unit price. However, of the 7 articles that are out there, oh, sorry, there's more than 7 articles. Of 7 of them, I am on, and they mainly look around consumption and harms of the related to the changes in consumption and harms related to the minimum unit price, as well as some reflections about the implementation of the policy, which we'll get into later. So what is the minimum unit price? As I'm sure all of you know, the minimum unit price was introduced in 2018. It sets a floor price for retail alcohol below which it cannot be sold. So the minimum unit price in the Northern Territory is about $1.30 per standard drink. In terms of conversion rates, this was very similar to its equivalent policy in Scotland at the time. So on just numbers alone or value of money, these are very similar policies. If you've heard of the Scottish one, they introduced it a little bit earlier in 2018. The intervention, as it was in the Northern Territory, was made deliberately to target cask wine consumption. This is because I'm getting to that in another slide. I will say that experts recommended $1.50 instead of a $1.30. However, beer sells for about $1.30 per standard drink, and so the decision was made to set it at $1.30 as to not affect the beer market, but still affect the cask wine market. So why cask wine? Well, cask wine has relatively high alcohol content. It's also one of the drinks that is preferenced or consumed disproportionately by heavy alcohol consumers. And it's sold cheaper than other products because of a difference in taxation. So products like beer and spirits are taxed by the amount of alcohol content they have, whereas wine is only taxed at how much it's sold for at retail. This meant that cask wine in particular could be sold for 60 cents per standard drink, whereas you'd have other beverages around that $1.30 mark. So really this intervention was about doubling the price of cask wine. And so the way that this is meant to work is that while it's a small increase in value per standard drink, only about 60 cents more expensive per standard drink, the idea is that the more alcohol you purchase, the larger a burden that becomes. And as a result, people usually spend a certain amount of money on alcohol, and so over time they'll be drinking substantially less. And the more you drink, the bigger an impact this kind of policy will have on you. So even though it applies to everyone, it really affects heavy drinkers drinking much more than, let's say, a moderate consumer of alcohol. And on that note, I just want to acknowledge that drinking in Australia is very top heavy. The top 10% of drinkers in Australia consume 50% of the alcohol. So that's the kind of coverage that you want to see from this kind of intervention. You really want to see 50% of alcohol sales covered if you want to affect just the drinking of the top 10% of drinkers. And so back in 2018 and a little bit before that as well, there were a whole bunch of different measures that were put in place. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these. Sorry, I normally give this talk to people who aren't in the Northern Territory. But essentially, cops in bottle shops, or pallies as they're known up there, were introduced on the same day in Alice Springs and around the same day across the territory, except for in Darwin and Palmerston. The banned drinkers register, I believe, was introduced a little bit earlier, and there were some other issues in Darwin and Palmerston. They weren't alcohol-specific interventions, but the Palmerston Hospital did open up around the same time as the minimum unit price came in, as well as there were changes to how their sobering up shelter worked. So when we talk about the evidence, we have to remember that this is a complicated space and it's very hard to infer change to any one thing. So let's talk about that change now, starting with changes in consumption. So what happens when you double the price of cask wine? It turns out it basically halves the consumption of cask wine. So a very direct effect. And you can see it's the thick black line at the bottom of this graph. We also saw no increases in other types of alcohol. So people didn't move to the next cheapest type of alcohol in a way that you might expect, or a way that is often portrayed in the media. And I will note that, actually, I think I covered this in the next slide. The next cheapest kind of alcohol is beer. So if people were going to move, they'd move to beer. We didn't see that. There's been a lot of talk about a switch to spirits. Spirits are a lot more expensive than cask wine ever was. So even if there was a switch, you'd expect to see people drinking a lot less. There was a rise in spirits sales, spirits consumption, but it started before the minimum unit price came into effect in the Northern Territory, and it's actually part of an Australia-wide trend. Spirits had a large increase across Australia around this time. However, the alcohol industry in particular likes to claim that it was because of the minimum unit price, specifically when it happens in the Northern Territory. There was also some wastewater data which showed that alcohol content in the wastewater substantially dropped after the introduction of the minimum unit price. They found that it did rise back up again after about 15 months. However, I will note that the wastewater data isn't precise. So the drop was substantial, but we'd really need a longer trend than this to be really sure of how that incline actually looked. Yeah, there's a lot of error in this, particularly due to the low population in the Northern Territory. They don't take as many samples there. Impact of COVID, I haven't talked about that yet. A lot of this data takes place before COVID came in. So this is really the stuff that we can attribute best to the change in alcohol policy. And just a note on how did this affect people's spending. So we did a survey where we asked people what their favorite drink was and how often they consumed it. We used their drink preferences to match onto online stores, how much they were advertising their alcohol for, to see how these prices shifted over time. And what we found is that people who drank within the national guidelines only saw an increase of about just over $3 a year in how much they were spending on alcohol. Whereas we saw a more substantial increase in heavy consumers, particularly those who drank cask wine. Cask wine consumers were excluded from this graph because there weren't many of them. I think there were 5 in the total sample, so we didn't want to put everything on those 5 people. But it just goes to show that, this kind of intervention, while it does affect everybody's drinking, it's really it's top heavy. It affects the heavier drinkers more meaningfully than it will ever affect the moderate consumers. So that's all well and good, but how about impacts on the health and justice system? So you don't just put in an alcohol policy to stop drinking, you want to see things actually improve as well. The majority of these are going to focus on Darwin and Palmerston, and this is mainly because there weren't Cops and Bottle Shops Pallies in Darwin and Palmerston. So it's the one area where we can attribute most of the effect to the minimum unit price. I will say this is using a lot of time series analyses. There's 2 types of effects we look for in these kinds of analyses. So either there's a gradual decline or there's a sudden drop. The sudden drops tend to be more indicative of an actual change, whereas a gradual decline, while a good indicator, can be due to some other factors. So just keeping that in mind as I go through these slides. We did see a significant and sudden drop in alcohol-related assaults in and around Darwin and Palmerston right after the minimum unit price came into effect. There's been a bit of you may have seen some articles talking about domestic violence and the reduction in domestic violence. And it's true that, this table's probably come out a bit blurry, but the minimum unit price was associated with a drop in domestic violence Northern Territory wide, which is great, but that also means that Pallies are caught up in that. As a result, it's harder to declare that it was the minimum unit price 100%. And as you can see from this table that's from Sarah Clifford's paper on the topic, there wasn't a Darwin-specific effect. So it's hard to make that conclusion, but it's a promising sign. Then we have protective custody episodes. Alcohol-related protective custody episodes from the police. We did see a significant gradual decline in these after the minimum unit price came in. Emergency department trends. We saw an effect Northern Territory wide. Particularly the 3-year evaluation of the minimum unit price found a 19% decline across the Northern Territory. However, it's much more mixed findings when we only look at Darwin and Palmerston. And you have to remember that the Palmerston Hospital opened up around the same time. So this, while we'd like to have a better understanding of the health impacts, particularly in that region, you can't really account for the opening of a new hospital when you're looking at the data. It makes things a little more difficult, but it is a promising sign. So yeah, hospital admissions. We did see some important sudden and gradual declines in specific ICD codes, which I've noted there. So there again, there was a gradual decline after the minimum unit price, which is quite promising. However, hospital admission trends did go up over the period as well. So, there's a long way to bring it back down, and we would like to see more of those sudden drops from the policy. Again, looking at ambulance data, and this was looking at, in order to know whether or not an ambulance presentation was alcohol related or not, we went through the notes of these ambulance, of the paramedics in the ambulance, and assessed from that which ones were alcohol related or not. And we did find a gradual decline in alcohol related attendances as a result of the minimum unit price, but not a sudden drop. Here's a paper I was involved in. Again, it was looking at people who were substance affected, taken into the emergency departments in Darwin and Palmerston by the police, and we did again see a gradual decline in these presentations after the minimum unit price was brought in. Now, we couldn't look at the sobering up shelter in Darwin because it expanded its service. It became 24 hours right around the same time. So we can't make any conclusions about that. However, around the territory, we did see declines in use. And you can see as well in the graph that there was already a substantial decline in use as well. But there was another decline when it came in. Now, road crashes, again, similar situation. There just aren't enough crashes in Darwin and Palmerston to make a firm conclusion about that site alone. However, across the territory, we did see a sudden drop in crashes around the time all these policies were brought in. Child protection trends is it's a difficult data set. So I will say we saw a gradual decrease in the number of care protection orders and out-of-home care, which is good. It's a good indicator, a good sign. Again, this is Northern Territory wide. Investigations finalized is a lot more about capacity of the services, much more than the demand. So we didn't really interpret that one too strongly. Okay, so that's the impacts that we can attribute to the minimum unit price. And these are things that all happened, the first year and a half out. And again, as has been noted in the chat, a lot of that was because of COVID. COVID did affect alcohol consumption and harms in the Northern Territory. And so it's harder to know what the long-term impact of the minimum unit price is. However, we can talk about there is a concept I want to talk about. A lot of what I've been talking about right now have been either been violence or specific injuries. I know there has been a bit of other content in there, but this has really been the preoccupation of I guess the evaluators or the government's interest in alcohol policy more broadly does focus a lot on violence. However, violence is a really small subset of alcohol-related harm. And the amount of alcohol that's consumed in the Northern Territory is a population-wide problem. It doesn't just affect the people who then become violent or the people who are affected by that violence. And that's why I wanted to talk about universal versus targeted policies. So, for example, the minimum unit price versus the BDR. Universal policies affect population-wide drinking, and people who are drinking at heavy levels who don't know that that's causing them a substantial amount of harm, who are unaware that they're heavy drinkers. And there's a wide range of different harms that are associated with drinking that can affect. Whereas something like the Banned Drinkers Register, or depending how it's implemented, the managed alcohol programs, these are only going to target a very small subset of people, and arguably they're not even effective for that. That's gone to potential wider implications. Oh, sorry. There we go. Sorry, the slide messed up on my screen. So when we're thinking about the potential for something like the minimum unit price, there's a whole range of different outcomes that we could be interested in. So something I'm interested in, and I'm trying to research at the moment, although there's been a lot of hurdles, unfortunately, is the effect a minimum unit price can have on birth outcomes. So alcohol exposure has a dose relationship with many negative birth outcomes, such as low weight, small birth length, early gestational birth, early gestational age. So sorry, I'll get to that comment later. There's but or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. These are issues that could be really effectively targeted by a minimum unit price. However, there's evaluators or the government. I will say the government hasn't really focused on these wider issues, and I've noted down there as well. There's disadvantage. Um, People who are disadvantaged, that disadvantage is perpetuated by the negative effects of alcohol in many communities. And that's something that really hasn't been sufficiently explored yet either. Um, and can only really, well, I believe it can only really come from universal policies rather than targeted and potentially discriminatory ones. Um, as well as we've seen some really promising trends in alcohol-related deaths. I will say we're looking into this further. This graph has not been subjected to rigorous statistical analysis or peer review, but it's a promising trend. Alcohol-related deaths have substantially dropped in the Northern Territory while they've risen everywhere else in Australia. And it looks like from the time period that the minimum unit price came into effect. So again, this isn't people being violent. This is the long-term effects of heavy alcohol consumption potentially reducing across the community. And it's something that, policymakers haven't necessarily been interested in. So what are some challenges in this space? I will say there's been a lack of maintenance of the policy. So just to run you through this graph really quickly, the red line is how much the minimum unit price is in terms of like monetary value, $1.30. But the real cost of it, accounting for inflation, is that blue line there that that slowly declines. So a minimum unit price today is worth less than a $1.10 minimum unit price back in 2018. So the real value of it has declined. And as a result, the proportion of the alcohol market that would have been affected by this price has declined as well. So it essentially means that the policy's just become less effective over time because it hasn't been updated for inflation. As a result, alcohol has become more affordable over time. People can purchase more for their dollar compared to other products, and as a result, harms should rise. I will note that should escalate if a minimum unit price is taken away. We've also recently discovered that the minimum unit price only covered 19% of the alcohol market. You'll remember I said that the top 10% of drinkers consumed 50% of the alcohol, and often 50% of the cheapest alcohol is often what they disproportionately consume. And we only found this out because 3 to 4 years after the minimum unit price, we got a 2-year snapshot of some retail sales data. Not having this data or not being able to know how much of the market would have been affected by the minimum unit price really hampered its implementation. And we might have seen much more substantial impacts if we'd been able to put in a minimum unit price that was based on these figures. For reference, the equivalent policy in Scotland covered 48% of the market. So really substantially different policies when you look at how much alcohol or how the proportion of drinking that they're affecting. And of course, this data was available to the alcohol industry the entire time. The alcohol industry have been a real burden in this space, both in that they've attacked independent researchers quite frequently. They've used their ownership of retail data to suggest that the minimum unit price was a failure, even though their own data doesn't show what they said it showed. But they've used their hold or their secrecy around the data to influence public discussion. And yeah, it's not great, but it really brings into question, these people are allowed to sell what is a harmful product to the community, and yet they're not obligated to be part of the public health solution to the problem that they're helping fuel. that they're benefiting from. So yeah, just something to think about. And again, this is just reiterating this point. In order to get really effective policy, we need to be able to estimate and know its impact or coverage precisely, and its changes to this kind of data collection or obligations of the alcohol industry. That's how we get that, by making that, by legislating them to be part of the solution. I will note that this nearly did happen in the Northern Territory. Unfortunately, at a hearing for the 2019 liquor bill, Retail Drinks Australia, one of Australia's alcohol lobby groups, opposed the point that would have allowed sales data to become mandatory. Collection of sales data to become mandatory, and now we don't have it. And obviously, the biggest challenge in this space is that the minimum unit price is meant to be axed by the new government. I don't know why it hasn't been. I was genuinely expecting it to be axed in October. I'm very hopeful that this is a sign that some change, maybe not retaining the policy, but maybe not completely abolishing the policy. I'm hoping something's in the works. Unfortunately, I am on the outside of those doors. I am not in that conversation. But I will say the reason it can be axed is because of the misleading information that the alcohol industry has put out there, whether it's that it wasn't effective or that people switched to spirits rather than drinking cask wine. I've even seen some articles that suggest drinking cask wine is somehow safer than drinking spirits. This is all misinformation. And removing the policy, even if it's, not as effective as it could have been or not as effective as it once was, removing it still goes against all the evidence. And I suspect that if it is removed, we will see a substantial and probably immediate rise in harms. Yes. And yes, that's not even getting into the other issues of other policies that are coming in currently. That being said, I do want to make the note that if we are going to change alcohol policy in the Northern Territory, then we should be considering improvements to how we monitor alcohol consumption and alcohol-related harm. If the government really thinks that their solutions to alcohol-related harm are going to be effective, then they should legislate ways, the best ways to measure those changes and harms. And if they're right, the data will show that. And if they're not, then we'll be able to talk about it more effectively. And that's the presentation. I'm sure I've gone over time, but thank you so much. I'm really grateful to the opportunity to present my work to you all.